No one will dare say numbers. So the best thing I'll say is countless working class white girls from across the country were systematically groomed and gang raped by predominantly Pakistani heritage men over decades in this country. And we cannot launch an inquiry to investigate what happened? What sort of country is this?
The grooming gang scandal has remained top of the news for a second week running, and whilst this story is decades old, it was partly reignited when the Labour MP Jess Phillips said that Labour would not hold a government-led national inquiry into grooming gangs and suggested that Oldham Council should do it locally themselves. Now, what is the point of public inquiries? Over £100 million a year has been spent on them for the past few decades. We have Hillsborough, Leveson, Grenfell, the Post Office most recently. But do they serve a purpose, and do they make any specific changes? To discuss this, I'm joined by Isabel Hardman. She's our assistant editor at The Spectator. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Raja Miah. He is a local campaigner and commentator who has been campaigning in Oldham for there to be a public inquiry into grooming gangs for the past 6 years. Now, Raja, I'd like to come to you first. Thank you for joining us. Why do you want there to be a government-led public inquiry into grooming gangs?
I think for us, in Oldham, it's a quest for truth and it's a quest for justice. And we've looked at what's happened in the past, particularly with the grooming gangs. And the campaigns in the main have been led by survivors or people who are inexperienced in navigating this. Now, for us to get this far, and yesterday, whilst the vote was a disappointment, what you've got to understand is I take it as a victory, and the people who've campaigned take it as a victory. Now it is now in the national discourse that the term Pakistani heritage rape gang, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, stood up in Parliament and used those exact words. We were being branded as racist and far-right campaigners when we used those words when we were campaigning, because the children we were speaking to were groomed and gang raped by that demographic, and we were told we can't say that. The Home Secretary now says that. So I look at yesterday and I take it as a victory on a campaign towards a public inquiry, and it's another step closer we get. Now, the reason why is because there have been inquiries in the past, investigations in the past, and it was Jess Phillips who wrote back to Oldham to say no, and you can have a local-based one, because every time they've tried to shift us to a place of a local inquiry, and a local inquiry can't get to the truth. It's as simple as that. It doesn't mean that the public inquiry will get to the truth, but we know that every local-based inquiry hasn't got to the truth. The local-based inquiries rely on those who are being investigated to provide the evidence that they're going to be investigated on. And local-based inquiries also rely on people of their goodwill to give testimony. You know, you can't call witnesses. And we got here off the back of a 6-year campaign where we removed 3 Labour Party leaders in the town in succession. Through the ballot box, through campaigning, we removed Sean Fielding, leader of Oldham Council, Arood Shah, leader of Oldham Council, Amanda Chadderton, leader of Oldham Council. All 3 of them, coincidentally, were then rewarded by the Labour Party for their loyalty in blocking our campaign. So Sean Fielding is now a councillor in Bolton. Arood Shah is now, as well as the leader of Oldham Council again, she's the chair of the National Constitutional Committee of the Labour Party. And Amanda Chadderton shamelessly went on, after we removed her, went on to work for Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, as a campaign manager. So there's something far more sinister going on here. And a public inquiry will not just expose what happened to these children and who failed them. A public inquiry will expose those who were complicit in the cover-up. And that is what yesterday brought. And that's the culmination of a 6-year campaign that we've been leading from a small northern town, a very political campaign. You know, we come at this from a very different place. We are political campaigners. This is a politically educated town, and this is a town that has took the Labour Party, at the height of the Labour Party. They had 47 councillors controlling this council. They now run a minority administration with 27 councillors, and they were forced with the independent councillors that we had elected to enter into a pact to write to the government. And we knew they'd say no, and we wanted them to say no, but what we wanted was in Parliament this conversation to take place where the world now knows what has gone on. Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition, talked about systemic failures. She talked about the industrial scale grooming and gang rape of children across the country. The world now knows that we are not the far-right campaigners that they portrayed us to be. We are decent, working class people from a town that cares about its children and wants this cover-up blown up and those responsible held to account. And that is why we want a public inquiry.
And Raja, out of interest, what did you think of the previous inquiry chaired by Alexis Jay? Because since there has been all this calls for a government-led inquiry, she said, well, her independent inquiry, if everyone just learnt the lessons from what she exposed in her report, then that's actually what the victims want. They don't want another inquiry. What do you make of that?
The Jay report, and I have nothing but admiration for Alexis Jay, particularly from the previous work in Rotherham and what that exposed. The ICSA report, I think is what you're referring to, the ICSA inquiry, did not look at the grooming gangs. It was a footnote. I think it was like a paragraph, So 7 years and it's a paragraph. And there's something else of significance in that. Telford, and there was a judge-led Telford inquiry afterwards, and more recently, a judge-led Telford inquiry only took place because Telford had been removed or not selected as one of the case studies for that ICSA report. So the Telford inquiry only took place because it was not selected as part of the ICSA case studies. And if you look at the Alexis Jay report, there's like a paragraph or something in terms of the grooming gangs. And the grooming gangs are something very specific, Natasha. The grooming gangs are something very specific. And they deserve investigating. Now, this is not to get away from Alexis Jay's very thorough, national inquiry that took place, the national investigation that took place over 7 years. But we have not looked at this case. And this case specifically, we now know, well, no one says numbers, do they? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? Is it 100,000? Is it more? No one will dare say numbers. So the best thing I'll say is countless working class white girls from across the country were systematically groomed and gang raped by predominantly Pakistani heritage men over decades in this country. And we cannot launch an inquiry to investigate what happened. What sort of country is this?
Isabel, I want to bring you in here. You have, and I want to broaden this topic out beyond the grooming gang scandal. You've covered several inquiries in your time. Most recently, we've had the Post Office inquiry. We've also had the COVID inquiry last year. What do you think is the point of inquiries, and which are the ones that have worked and which are the ones that haven't?
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
I mean, I think it's really interesting to look at the anatomy of a government response to calls for an inquiry and then the inquiry once it is published, because it tends to be entirely the same regardless of party. So one of the inquiries that I've covered in quite a lot of detail was the Mid-Staffs inquiry, which was led by Robert Francis KC. And the government really resisted for a long time the calls for the inquiry and then the calls for it to be a statutory public inquiry. And you see that again and again with different scandals where initially campaigners are sort of given their inquiry. But as Raja said, that local inquiry, for instance, doesn't have the power to summon witnesses to give evidence under oath. And so you can end up with a very piecemeal picture of what actually happened. And therefore, a lack of accountability for what has gone wrong. So ministers tend to delay making the inquiry as powerful as possible. Now, there are some good reasons for that, which is that public inquiries do take a long time and they're quite costly. But once the public inquiry is granted, politicians tend to think, right, we've done that now. That means we've learnt the lessons and we don't have to think about this anymore. It's not going to be raised in the Commons. No one's going to give us grief about it at press conferences because we can just say, well, there's a public inquiry. We've set up a public inquiry. 7 years later, by which time most of them have exited the scene, at least front bench politics, the inquiry publishes. And again, there's a flurry of interest. People give press conferences. I'm thinking now particularly actually of the Chilcot inquiry, which again, took a very long time, cost a huge amount of money. I sat in what's known as the lock-in for Chilcot when it eventually reported, where we were given, I think it was about 2.5 hours as journalists to read the embargoed documents. Now, I mean, there are like 12 volumes of the Chilcot report. So we were all desperately thumbing through the executive summary, which in itself was about the size of, I wouldn't say War and Peace, but it wasn't a small document itself. We reported on it. Tony Blair gave one of his many press conferences where he ruminated about Iraq, having obviously left government. Conservatives were in government by this point. And then everyone moved on. The next day, the news agenda was about something else. And a few people continued to read their way through the Iraq War Inquiry report. A few people had a look at what the recommendations were. In terms of political salience and the political narrative, nobody was talking even a week later about what those lessons were that governments needed to implement, despite the fact that military intervention is not a one-off thing that just happened with Iraq.
Yeah.
Despite the fact, actually, in the intervening years, we had an intervention in Libya, which had exhibited some of the same failures, particularly in terms of post-conflict planning, as Iraq. So governments were manifestly not learning the lessons in the intervening period. They had a chance to learn those lessons again, weren't implemented. Another example of this, which is particularly troubling, I think, is the Harold Shipman inquiry. Now, this was a very long time ago, but it was only last year, 2024, that the government announced measures on an independent reviewer of death certificates that were recommended in the Shipman inquiry, which concluded, I think, in about 2002. And the victims of those crimes, the families whose parents were killed by Harold Shipman, had been campaigning for years. And actually, one of the things that I find particularly egregious about this is that you put people through a public inquiry, which is not a small ask. It's the same as asking somebody who has been, and particularly pertinent in this case, in Oldham and other grooming gang cases, you are asking someone who has been raped to relive their trauma, or you are asking somebody who saw their neighbours burned to death in Grenfell to relive their trauma. Not just when they give evidence, but when the whole inquiry is going on, other people are telling stories that chime with their experience. People who they know, who were in the police, who ignored them, are giving evidence. All of that is hugely re-traumatizing. That has a point if it then leads to people being held accountable and lessons being learned and governments actually implementing those lessons. If you then have a 10-year delay in some of those lessons being implemented, then that is a real failure of the victims, of people you've asked to step up. And so really, I think it's not so much the question, are public inquiries worth it? It's, does Westminster have the mechanisms and culture, firstly, to set them up properly, and secondly, to do anything about them once they report? So it always comes back to the culture in Westminster.
Of course. And Isabel, just following up from that, do you think part of the problem is this obsession with individuals when an inquiry looks back on a crisis? I'm thinking specifically about the COVID inquiry, and there was hours spent looking at the way Dominic Cummings would speak to colleagues over WhatsApp, and they'd say, is this an appropriate use of language, when there were so many bigger topics to explore?
Yeah, I mean, partly because as humans, we all find that kind of stuff much more tangible than talking about, number of ventilators, number of beds, Nightingale hospitals, and that sort of thing. But also, I think, again, it is a Westminster problem, which is that we are so obsessed with dynamics within Westminster, and they are important. The dynamics of the Blair-Brown government are essential to understanding how that project failed or succeeded, and what happened in terms of big decisions on spending. But they're not the only thing. And we do not have the attention spans as a political class to pay decent attention to proper questions of policy. And I think that's, one of the reasons why we've ended up in this bizarre situation in the past week where nothing has actually changed materially for victims in the past week. It's just that some powerful people who other people in Westminster pay attention to started firing off some tweets. Now that's, overall that is to the benefit of victims, but is that really the system that we want? Is that, do we really want politics to be this sort of pinball of we've got to pay attention to this, or we've got to make an urgent response to that, as opposed to, and this comes back to, what do you do once a public inquiry reports? You actually have to do quite a lot of plodding work that no one's going to pay attention to. And I think the fact that Yvette Cooper sort of, rushed to the Commons on Monday to announce that the government was implementing some of the ICSA recommendations showed that we are stuck in this kind of pinball machine, because I suspect next week we will be talking about something entirely different. And that, again, will be led by the people who people pay attention to in Westminster. And that's very rarely white working class victims of rape. It's very rarely tenants stuck in a tower block where they're worried about the fire safety.
And Raja, could you tell me a little bit about what you expect would be the best end result after a public inquiry? I think it might be fair to say that you have lost faith in government institutions and the council, perhaps. And so I'm interested to hear, why do you think that a public inquiry could achieve what you want, having been let down by the public institutions themselves so much?
Because I've seen in parts of the world what happens when democracy breaks down. And people need to understand, in the places I come from, in the towns and cities where there is this working class, underclass, this demonization of our people, of our communities. This is what we are on the brink of, and August was an indicator of what may happen and will be worse if we do not rebuild trust in the very institutions that are the foundations of our society, of our democracy. We want to elect politicians who represent us, who are our voice. We want the systems and processes to take care of those who are the most vulnerable. And all of that has broken down in this. And for that to be repaired, a public inquiry will not just expose those who failed these children. It's not just about holding them to account. There's something far deeper taking place, in which the very fabric of our democracy has been undermined in towns such as mine. And so I don't want to be rude to any of you, but you need to understand something very clearly. And it is only because of people like me and brave councillors in that council chamber that people have not rioted on the street, because we are desperately saying to our people, we will fix this through the right and proper way. There is no need to go out onto the streets and start attacking mosques, start blowing up buildings. There is no need for that. We will fix this through the right and proper way, because if we don't fix it this way, which way are we going to fix it?
What would be your reaction, Raja, to, Reform? The Reform Party have said, if Labour don't go ahead with this government-led inquiry, we're going to do our own. Would you endorse that?
I think, with the greatest of respect to Reform, they are very new in this, and they haven't quite understood what they can do and what they can't do. And what if they set about doing something that then can't deliver, what will happen to those survivors and those communities who've put their faith in them? So I have contacted Richard Tice. I've spoken with Rupert Lowe. I'm desperately pleading with them. Please pause and take some time to understand what the processes in this democracy are, how we can go about them, rather than making promises and taking people down a road where then you will also fail them.
And lastly, Isabel, what do you think about sort of, maybe there's a new process of less traditional routes of having public inquiries? For example, the Reform Party holding their own public inquiry. I think it sometimes seems like the media holds its own public inquiry. Do you think we're moving away from £100 million a year spent for the last decade on public inquiries, and there's going to be slightly different sort of trial by media, trial by different political parties?
I mean, I hope not, but it is it is difficult to look at the current inquiry system and to say this is the silver bullet. And I don't, that obviously Raja's not suggesting that in any way at all. And I think what everyone wants is a more agile inquiry system with greater power after reporting to enforce the recommendations it has made. There are currently, no parliamentary mechanisms for following up public inquiries. And it's something that sort of serious parliamentarians are quite concerned about and are hoping to try to rectify through the select committee system and so on. As I said, I'm not entirely sure that the media is particularly helpful in this, particularly the political media, because we're generalists and we are experts in the parties and in the dynamics between, who hates who in Number 10, which is important. But I think that often comes at the expense of our policy colleagues who actually understand what is going on in terms of structures, local authorities, policing, and so on. And, perhaps I shouldn't argue this because it sounds quite self-loathing, but I think we should be less important and that our policy colleagues should be more important and I think the COVID press conferences really showed that, actually. I think, with all due respect to my political editor colleagues, not many of them seem to know very much about antibodies and antigens. And the questioning very quickly ended up being about, but Matt Hancock said this 2 weeks ago, do you disagree with him? As opposed to the detailed issues that were actually affecting NHS staff at the time, whether it be, bed capacity, ratios of staff, and so on. So I think we need to be careful as political journalists to remember what we can actually do and what we don't actually know that much about, and sort of back off and let the specialists do their jobs as well.
It's very interesting. Isabel Hardman and Raja Miah, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.